Yes, Mr. Millett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, before I continue, I should just say that I am about to go through the key points in the chronology of the night, and there is a series of photographs of the building on fire during the course of my presentation, which now continues to follow. I did get around some representatives of core participants during the lunch break, but I fear not enough. So I'm going to have to repeat, I'm afraid, the trigger warning now. There are images which we are going to look at, which some may find distressing. They're not a video, and there's no more sound, but they are still photographs of the building on fire. And so if anybody thinks they might feel that these are distressing, then I think now would be the time for them to leave.
Yes, well, if anyone feels uncomfortable about seeing these photographs, do feel free to get up and leave now. I'm quite happy to wait a minute or two while you do so. But I don't see any sign of movement, so I think, Mr. Millett, you can carry on.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. In terms of the other key points in the chronology, including the LFB response, the LFB provided us very recently with a very detailed timeline report for the first hour after the first attendances of the pumps at Grenfell Tower, which runs from that point until 2 a.m. or so. That timeline is in a document which was disclosed to core participants pretty well immediately last week. It is a heavily caveated report, and great caution should be taken with the times and the events in it, save where indicated. And I should just make it clear that although it is, we find, an extremely helpful document, it is not an inquiry document. From our own work, we can identify the following particularly important time points in the night with some degree of confidence. Although, of course, the accuracy of these time points does depend on how the evidence emerges. After the first attendance of the first 4 pumps, at 1:13, the LFB, and specifically firefighter Mike Dowden, who was watch manager B from G271 pump from North Kensington, made the first request for a hydraulic platform and make pumps 6. In other words, increase the attendance of fire engines attending the scene. And as I've said before, the reference to pumps is the number of fire engines at the scene or requested. Make pumps 6 is to increase the number of fire engines from 4 to 6. Firefighter Dowden was the first incident commander at the scene. At 1:14 a.m., the order for the hydraulic platform was changed to a high-reach ladder or aerial appliance. There is some evidence to be explored in detail that also at 1:14, and so after pumps have been made up to 6, the first firefighter crew opened the kitchen door of flat 16 for the first time. By 1:15 a.m., a hose stream was being applied to the east elevation, and at this point, burning debris was continuing to fall down, the fire by now having spread to level 5, floor 5. At 1:19, the LFB called for make pumps 8, increasing requested attendance from 6 to 8. There is some evidence to be explored in detail that the first firefighter crew actually got into the flat 16 kitchen at about 1:20 a.m. after pumps had been made up to 8 and attempted to extinguish the fire within the kitchen. At 1:24 a.m., the LFB called to make pumps 10. By 1:26 a.m., the fire has spread vertically up the right-hand column on the east face, a climb of some 19 stories, about 50 metres, in the 12 minutes or so since the fire took hold of the cladding at 1:14 at the latest. And according to Dr. Lane's preliminary report, about 20 flats were exposed to the flame front by this point. At 1:27 a.m., the LFB called to make pumps 15, plus now 2 aerial appliances. By 1:29, the fire had reached the very top of the east facade. And here is figure 90 from Professor Bisbee's report, which is an annotated extract, as the slide says, from the CCTV footage from the southwest camera, and correcting the timestamp, it gives 1:29. And you can see there the fire having reached the very top of the east elevation in the northeast corner of the building. At around the same time, 1:29, the LFB called to make pumps 20 and for 2 fire and rescue units, or FRUs. At 1:31, the LFB called to make pumps 25. At 1:36 a.m., the fire was spreading in 2 opposite directions, laterally on the east elevation of the tower, towards the northeast corner and towards the southeast corner. And you can see from this slide now exhibited that there were multiple internal fires by this point in the northeast part of the building. You will also see that the fire has spread southwards towards the southeast corner beyond the column marked B5. And that column is the column which abuts the kitchen to flat 16. At 1:40, station manager Andrew Walton from Kingston arrives to take command as incident commander. At or at some point before 1:50 a.m., station manager Walton took over from watch manager Mike Dowden, who had been incident commander from arrival of the first pumps until that point. We will be exploring as best we can what happened at handover from incident commander Dowden to incident commander Walton. By 1:42 a.m., the fire had spread to the north elevation via the top of the northeast corner column. And here is a photograph taken at some distance from the north, as is shown by the purple arrow on the plan to the left of the photograph, which shows where the fire was on the building at that time. By 1:52, the fire on the exterior of the north elevation was well developed. Not only was it spreading across the north facade, but it was also spreading southwards across the east facade. And this photograph, as the purple arrow shows, is taken from the east and shows how the fire right up and down the north elevation had taken hold, and also on the top few floors how the fire had moved from column B5 in a southwards direction towards the southeast column of the building, above level 17. And by this time, as you can see, there were multiple internal fires on the east face. According to Dr. Lane's preliminary calculations, some 26 flats were exposed to the flame front at this time. At 2:04 a.m., the LFB called to make pumps 40 plus 4 aerial appliances. A 40-pump fire is a very rare occurrence indeed. Commissioner Danny Cotton, who has provided a witness statement to the inquiry will say that the last one was in 2012 and the one before that was in 1973. At 2:06 a.m., the LFB called a major incident which implemented gold, silver and bronze command structure. At 2:08 a.m., the fire was progressing, as we can see from this picture, diagonally across the top of the east face and diagonally across the north face. By 2:10 a.m., some 34 flats were exposed to the flame front by Dr. Lane's current provisional estimates. At about 2:15 a.m., DAC McLaughlin takes over as incident commander from Mr. Walton, and 1 minute later calls for 10 FRUs, fire rescue units. We will be exploring the roles and the precise order of command as between Station Manager Walton and DAC McLaughlin and Group Manager Welch in the period between 1:50 to 2:15. By 2:22, the fire had passed around the southeast corner column of the tower at its topmost parts and was now beginning to spread downwards across the south face. By 2:23 a.m., some 53 flats were exposed to the flame fronts by Dr. Lane's current provisional estimates. By 2:30 a.m., the whole of the east face of the tower was reported to be fully involved in the fire. At 2:32 a.m., the LFB called Make Aerials 4, and at 2:44 a.m., Assistant Commissioner Rowe took over from Deputy Assistant Commissioner McLaughlin as Incident Commander. At 2:47 a.m., Assistant Commissioner Rowe took the decision to change the fire survival guidance formally from stay put to advise people to make efforts to leave the building. Based on a preliminary analysis of the CCTV cameras in the lobby of the tower, by this time, 2:47 a.m., it would appear that around 187 occupants, or 64%, had evacuated the tower, leaving some 107 people still within the building. After the stay-put guidance was formally changed, the CCTV footage suggests that a further 36 additional occupants evacuated from Grenfell Tower. By about 2:49 a.m., the fire had started to attack the top of the west face at the northwest corner and then started spreading across and down that face. By 3:08 a.m., the fire was spreading laterally across the west face, as you can see from this picture. And by 3:09, only a minute or so later, some 70 flats were exposed to the flame front, or had been. By 3:48 a.m., large parts of the south face were now alight. And this photograph is taken from the southeast corner of the building, as the purple arrow shows. And you can see there on the left the structure of the roof structure at Barrington Walk and the fire on the south face in a diagonal pattern. By 4:03 a.m., the two flame fronts wrapping round the building had converged at level 23 of the southwest top corner of the building. By this time, some 98 flats were exposed or had been exposed to the flame front, according to Dr. Lane. At 4:43, multiple internal fires were raging around the building. By that time, some 106 flats had been exposed to the flame front. At 4:47, what we believe to be the third last evacuee from the tower evacuated. At 6:05 a.m., the second last evacuee evacuated. At 8:07 a.m., the last occupant of the tower evacuated. At 13:02 on the 14th of June, Assistant Commissioner Ellis took over as incident commander. And at 19:55 p.m. on the 14th of June, Assistant Commissioner Ellis declared that there was no longer any savable life in the building. As part of the factual evidence that you will hear in Phase 1, we will be trying to piece together a much more detailed chronology of the events on that night. To that end, the evidence of the bereaved, the survivors, and the residents will be crucial in helping us to understand the conditions in and around the tower on that night, and particularly the conditions within individual flats, in the lobbies, and on the stairs, which were so critical in terms of the individual's ability to escape. And I now turn to themes which are emerging and key lines of inquiry for Phase 1. In this final section of our opening, I want to outline some of the preliminary themes which are emerging, both from the factual and the expert evidence, and to outline some of the key lines of inquiry which we will be pursuing in this Phase 1 of the inquiry's work. I should emphasise that what follows is not intended to be an exclusive list of topics that we will be covering. The expert evidence that we have already served is already extremely voluminous, and it would be impossible to capture in my opening now all of the detailed issues which are likely to arise. What I do want to do is to outline some of the most significant aspects of the evidence to date and the key questions which will have to be examined during this part of the inquiry's work. First of all, cause and origin. In terms of cause and origin of the fire, as I have already outlined, the available evidence currently suggests that the origin of the fire was in or around the tall fridge freezer in the kitchen of flat 16. The evidence also suggests that it is more likely than not that the fire had an accidental cause. However, vital expert work in this area is continuing, and in particular in the field of forensic electrical engineering. And as I've already indicated, the inquiry's preliminary forensic electrical engineering work started in November last year. It is hoped that Dr. Duncan Glover's examination of the wiring in Flat 16's kitchen and the electrical appliances within the kitchen will help to narrow down the area of origin and also to identify the cause of the fire. This type of forensic examination is inevitably painstaking, and the inquiry will provide an update as to progress as soon as it can. As I've already said, it's hoped that a report from Dr. Glover will be available during the course of Phase 1 and in good time before October. The inquiry has also taken steps to obtain further factual evidence from the occupants of Flat 16. All three of the occupants of flat 16 have cooperated with the inquiry, and they have provided the inquiry with supplemental statements which address key areas over and above those that they provided to the police in the statements which have already been disclosed. Mr. Kabidi, whose call you have already heard and who was the principal tenant of flat 16, has given 8 statements to the police, including one very recently, which we are still preparing for disclosure to core participants. And only just last Friday evening, he helpfully provided the inquiry with a statement as well, an inquiry statement. He will be called to give oral evidence if necessary and if he is fit to do so in September, a point I made earlier this morning. Mr. Kabidi lived in flat 16 for some 25 years prior to the fire. He raised the alarm on the night of the fire, including making the first 999 call, which you've just heard, alerting the fire brigade to the fire. He was the only occupant of flat 16 to see the conditions in the kitchen before leaving the flat, and he took on his mobile phone a series of videos from outside the tower, which we believe to be the earliest images available, including of the fire breaking out of the flat and taking hold of the facade. The witness statements of the 2 other occupants, Elsa Afewerki and Almaz Kinfu, both those they did for the police and those that they have done for the inquiry, will also be read into the record. They were also occupants of flat 16 on the night of the fire, and they escaped. It is also hoped that this further factual evidence and that of the firefighters who fought the initial fire within the compartment, within flat 16, will further assist in terms of how the fire started and how it developed and was able to exit into the facade. That is the next topic. Exit of the fire from flat 16. In terms of fire spread out of flat 16, the inquiry's experts, including Dr. Lane and Professor Bisbee, have identified a number of different possible routes by which flames could have escaped from flat 16 and ignited the facade. At present, the available evidence suggests that the initial fire may have been relatively small and certainly not reached flashover, in other words, the temperature at which everything in the fire room combusts, before it spread out of flat 16 and into the cladding. At this stage of our investigations, it appears that the most likely route of fire spread out of flat 16 was via parts of the window surrounds, which were penetrated by fire, and combustible materials igniting within those surrounds before impinging upon exposed polyethylene edges of the ACP rain screen panels on the exterior. Professor Torero has also addressed this in detail in his report by using first principles of physics. His view is that a fire with characteristics common to any residential fire in a kitchen would have resulted in the loss of strength of the UPVC surrounding the window, exposing the combustible components in the window and leading to ignition of those combustible components of the facade system. However, this will be the subject of further investigation, including by the inquiry's experts who wish to investigate the roles which may have been played by the various of the materials that were present in the window framing and the cladding system, and to conduct further tests. External flame spread. As to external flame spread, more generally across the building, the inquiry's experts have identified a range of mechanisms which may have affected the fire spread on the night. In section 10 of Dr. Lane's report, she has provided a detailed explanation of the materials which were present both around the windows and in the facade system. She has explained, for example, the extent to which the new windows and the rain screen system created cavities and voids which were potentially significant in terms of the building's ability to resist the spread of fire. She has identified 6 different possible pathways A to F, as she has labelled them, for fire spread, both around the windows and also through the building envelope. In section 6 of Professor Bisbee's report, he attempts to explain which features of the building are likely to have affected vertical, downward, and horizontal flame spread, all of which appear to have played a significant part in the fire. Although he is clear that the presence of ACP rain screen cladding with a highly combustible polyethylene core was the primary reason for the upward, downward, and lateral flame spread, he has actively considered other factors, including the role of the channels and cavities in the facade system and its geometry. Professor Torero has also considered this topic, although he has concluded that the physical details in this particular cladding system may have had an impact on flame spread rates. Upward flame spread rates were not particularly fast in comparison with international experience of cladding fires, and that detailing of the facade, as opposed to its material composition, may have had only a minor impact in terms of the evolution of this fire. Those investigations are very much ongoing, and they will be the subject of further expert investigation. There are 2 particular areas which require further consideration, and they are, first, the extent to which the architectural crown at the top of the building may have played a significant role in terms of lateral fire spread around the building. Both Professor Bisbee and Professor Torero consider that the crown detailing on the building may have been responsible for the lateral fire spread on the building, where the rate of lateral fire spread appears to have been at its fastest. This lateral fire spread appears to result in a significant amount of burning debris falling down the building, igniting the facade system in lower floors of the building. The second area, which will require further investigation in particular, is the extent to which the combustible PIR insulation, both in the facade itself and around the windows, may also have played a role in terms of the flame spread on the night. In terms of this latter point, Professor Torero has sought to explain some of the complexities that were a feature of this particular cladding system. One of the features of his report is an explanation of the complicated relationship between the ACP rain screen and the PIR insulation. His view is that the two interact, and that the combination of the two is important to understand in terms of flame spread rates. He also addresses the potential for the PIR insulation to burn for a longer time period, which can be critical when defining the capacity of the fire to break back into the building. What is abundantly clear is that the building envelope created an intolerable fire hazard. There was a catastrophic failure of the rain screen cladding in terms of its ability to resist the fire spread across the walls of the building. All of the relevant experts are clear that the consequence was a fire which affected multiple stories and multiple compartments, with many post-flashover fires occurring internally on multiple compartments and on multiple stories. I turn next to the performance of the active and passive fire safety systems. As to these, it is important to recognise that the building was designed and maintained in the expectation that nothing other than a single compartment fire would occur, and that it could be dealt with by early fire service intervention. the assumptions underlying this design intent and the regulatory framework underpinning those assumptions will be explored in more detail as part of the expert evidence and also at phase 2. The key point for present purposes is that the active and passive fire safety systems were required to mitigate an extraordinary and unexpected event once compartmentation failed and a whole building fire was inevitable. Dr. Lane has made an assessment of how those active and passive fire safety systems performed on the night of the fire. Her investigation has so far highlighted a number of areas of serious concern. Those include the following. Flat front doors. The performance of the flat front doors in terms of, one, their composition, and two, their ability to resist the spread of fire, and also three, their condition and maintenance, is a matter for investigation. One particular question we will need to explore is whether the self-closing devices were properly installed and maintained. That is relevant to the question of the smoke conditions in the lobbies and in the single staircase on the night. Professor Torrero has also addressed this topic in his report. He has explained that although a fire of considerable severity was progressing across the exterior of the building, he considers it reasonable to have expected the internal compartmentation to have performed on the night, because the flats ought to have been capable of withstanding the internal fires in the flats and not leading to a compromise of the lobbies and the stairs. It will therefore be necessary to explore in some detail how the flat front doors performed on the night. Secondly, the firefighting lift. Failure of the lift to perform, as appears to have been intended as a firefighting lift, is a matter of very serious concern. There are a number of indications which suggest that the lift did not have the firefighting features it was intended to and did not operate when the LFB expected it to on the night. That will be the subject of further investigation, including understanding how the lift could have affected firefighting and rescue operations on the night, and also obtaining from the relevant early attendance firefighters what they found when they tried to get the lift to work. The next issue, third issue, is the water supply or pressure question, and in detail, the question of whether a wet riser fire main would have or should have been provided instead of a dry riser. There is some evidence to suggest that there were difficulties associated with accessing the dry risers and gaining access to water, particularly on higher levels within the tower. Although a wet riser might have suffered from similar difficulties in terms of coping with multiple hoses within the tower, it will be necessary to explore further whether a wet rising main could have enhanced the speed of response to the initial fire and the ability to maintain water pressure higher up the tower. More generally, as to water pressure available at Grenfell Tower on the night, the inquiry has instructed a water expert to advise on water supply systems and issues at the tower. He is Dr. Ivan Stoyanov, who is Senior Lecturer in Water Systems Engineering at Imperial College in London, and he will be preparing a report on that subject for phase 2 of the inquiry's work. Finally, we have smoke ventilation as an issue. There are questions over the smoke ventilation system and whether it operated as intended. There is also some evidence to suggest that the system didn't operate as it should have on the night, and that the fire service attempted to take control of the system but were unable to do so. Whilst it is very important to recognise the limitations of this system, even when it is operational, including the fact that this system was never designed to address smoke control on multiple lobbies as opposed to a single floor, and couldn't be expected to provide complete protection to the single staircase during the fire. Nonetheless, it'll be necessary to explore what the firefighters found on arrival at the scene on the night. It will also be necessary to examine how and the extent to which the system might have been capable of operating to support the fire and rescue efforts, or to impede or diminish the spread of smoke on the night. I next turn to additional lines of inquiry. In addition to the lines of inquiry I have already identified, Dr. Lane's report also highlights some other issues with the fire safety systems in the building which will require further investigation. The first is the fire doors to the single staircase. The performance of the fire doors connecting the lift lobbies to the single staircase will have to be examined in detail. This will include the extent to which these doors were able to resist the spread of fire, and the extent to which stair doors may have been held open during firefighting or search and rescue operations, including by the presence of firefighting hoses, or because of a failure in any self-closing or other closing devices. The second issue for further inquiry is the performance of the single staircase itself and the extent to which it complied with the relevant regulations. That will include examination of its width and the provision for handrails, and whether it impeded the passage of firefighters during operations, especially when wearing breathing apparatus or extended duration breathing apparatus. Thirdly, the gas supplies and installations to the tower. This includes the extent to which the gas supplies were capable of being isolated on the night and the compliance of the gas installation works that had been carried out inside the tower. A specialist gas expert, Mr. Rodney Hancocks, who is Director of Gas Distribution Solutions Limited, has been instructed by the inquiry to consider these issues, and he will be preparing a report at Phase 2. In terms of our Phase 1 fact-finding, we will want to understand what happened in terms of isolating the gas supply on the night and what evidence there is of any compromise of or breaches to the gas piping inside the building during the fire. I next turn to conditions inside the building and the movement of individuals. Certain patterns are emerging about the conditions inside the building and the movement of persons within it on the night. We already have important information about the place where each of the deceased was found, and also about the pattern of evacuations which we have been able to piece together from the CCTV footage in the lobby of the tower. There is also some CCTV footage from inside the tower in the lift and on the 7th floor lobby, and the pattern of damage to the building also tells us something about the conditions which occurred in different parts of the building on the night. Dr. Lane has addressed this in some detail in section 20 of her report, and Professor Terrero has done the same in his report at sections 5.3.2 to 5.3.3 of his report. But there are some themes already evident from the information currently available to the inquiry. First, it appears that below level 18, the majority of the deceased were found in the floor where they resided. Above level 18, the majority of the deceased had moved upwards, and many up to level 23. Secondly, on every level of the tower, people escaped away from the 6th flat on each floor, i.e. the flats which straddled the north and east faces of the building, and which were directly above flat 16. No fatalities were recovered from the 6th flat on any floor. In other words, the flats in the northeast corner of the tower. Thirdly, given the movement of persons inside the building and based on the damage patterns to the inside of the building, it appears likely that the lobbies and stair at certain levels and times may have become particularly affected by heat and smoke, possibly involving a hot zone in the middle of the tower between levels 13 and 16. Fourthly, we will want to explore as precisely as we can how the conditions in the lobbies and on the stair changed as the night progressed. Some of the firefighter evidence suggests that the lobbies and the stair between levels 6 and 10 began to be particularly compromised with smoke at around 1:38 a.m. Fifthly, the available CCTV evidence from the lift and the 7th floor lobby also supports the contention that between 1:30 a.m. and 1:40 a.m. the conditions in the lower part of the tower began to deteriorate markedly. Sixthly, between 1:59 a.m. and 2:58 a.m., in particular about level 10, some of the firefighter witnesses have described as incredibly hot, quotes, unquotes. And the stair at level 10 is also described as, quotes, boiling hot, quotes, unquotes, with thick, heavy smoke between levels 7 and 12. Seventh, a preliminary analysis of a number of the 999 calls, which has been done by Professor Torero, suggests that early smoke migration between the 11th and the 14th floors may have occurred. Eighth, this is a slide or pictures from Professor Torero's report. He has identified some police helicopter footage which shows that there may have been early passage of smoke through the building at about 2 a.m., with smoke coming from windows on the south and west facades on the opposite side of the building to where the fire was spreading on its east face, indicating that internal compartmentation had been breached at both mid-level in the building and around floor 20. What you see on the screen there are figures 49, 50, and 51 of Professor Torero's report. And you can see smoke emanating in all three pictures from a room on that floor, about floor 20. We will want to explore all of these topics in more detail as the evidence develops and try to understand precisely how the conditions in the building developed on the night and how that affected the ability of people to evacuate if they made attempts to do so. We will also be exploring whether any failure of compartmentation inside the building was due to the physical features of the building, including its doors and their closers, or also to human actions on the night, including the actions of the firefighters. The next topic will be toxic gases. Professor Purser, who has been engaged as an inquiry expert, will also be providing expert evidence on toxicity issues, including the extent to which toxic gases inside the tower are likely to have affected individuals' behaviour and led, in some cases, to their deaths. He will also be providing evidence on the production of toxic gases of some of the materials which have been found within the tower, including the cladding materials and the materials which have been found around the refurbished windows. His report will be provided as soon as it is available. The last topic for further investigation under this heading is helicopters. The inquiry has been made aware of an ongoing IOPC investigation into the use of police helicopters on the night of the fire, including whether that might have encouraged some residents to remain in place or to move to the top of the tower, and whether the operation of the police helicopters could have worsened the fire. We anticipate hearing some factual evidence which may touch upon these issues, and we will obviously make sure that the inquiry is apprised of the progress of the IOPC investigation as it develops. I now turn to the emergency services response, and I start with basic issues. From her perspective of a fire safety expert, Dr. Lane has also looked at a number of topics which are relevant to the building's responsiveness to firefighting on the night. It is right to emphasise right at the start that Dr. Lane is not a firefighter and has never been a firefighter, and will leave qualitative questions about the firefighting response to Mr. Steve McGurk in Phase 2. He is the inquiry's firefighter expert. But an assessment of fire safety matters within Grenfell Tower and as to how it behaved on the night necessarily requires consideration of the fire service's response to the incident. Dr. Lane has highlighted two particular points. First, the ability of the fire service to carry out external firefighting. Again, the fundamental assumption under the relevant regulatory regime is that all firefighting will be carried out internally. Hence, a rising main is provided for that purpose inside the building, in this case, a dry riser. But even though there was no requirement to make provision for external firefighting access, she has explored and will continue to explore the extent to which effective external firefighting operations were possible and any factors which hampered those external firefighting efforts on the night. Second, the extent to which the fire service itself were able to communicate with individuals within Grenfell Tower on the night, and in particular the means available to the fire service for doing that once the stay-put policy was formally abandoned at 2:47. It will be necessary to explore what methods of communication were used, what they were, and whether any of them were adopted on the night, and if so, with what effect. In terms of the evidence about the LFB response on the night, as matters stand as of Friday, we have disclosed to call participants 250 witness statements from LFB firefighters out of a total of 615 disclosed to us by the police. There are a further 11 LFB firefighter statements currently with the Met awaiting non-objection to disclosure to the CPs. These statements were almost all taken by the Met, and they include statements not just from firefighters but from the investigation teams, counsellors, and a number of exhibit-only statements. Of the statements that the inquiry has now disclosed to CPs, as matters stand today, we plan to read some 74 into the inquiry record so that they are publicly available, but not to call the makers as oral witnesses. And we plan to call as oral witnesses some 52 firefighters to speak to their statements and to give further evidence orally and answer questions. But we will keep these numbers under review. The firefighter statements taken by the police are a vivid and valuable record of the collective and the individual firefighter experiences on the night. Commissioner Danny Cotton, who was the Commissioner of the London Fire Brigade and a firefighter from the age of 18, was present on the scene from 2:29 a.m. that night. She has described the fire in her detailed statement to the inquiry. You will be hearing her evidence later in this Phase 1. but she explains, and I quote, "I have never seen a building where the whole of it was on fire. Nobody has ever seen that. It was incredible. It was so alien to anything I had ever seen." Close quote. That was the stated experience of all of the firefighters who attended the fire on the night, whose evidence you will hear or read in the weeks to come. Nobody doubts that the fire itself, in terms of scale and spread, was unprecedented and exceptional in the collective knowledge and experience of the London Fire Brigade and nationally. Whether such a building envelope fire was foreseeable in terms of type, in light of a growing body of evidence about previous cladding fires, and what contingency plans might have been made for it by the LFB, are different questions to which I will return shortly. There are, we say, 8 questions about the LFB decision-making. We are going to be exploring not only what the firefighters did on the night, but what decisions they made. Those decisions were made by incident commanders. We want to examine when they were made and what the basis for those decisions was, in policy and in training, and whether any alternative strategies presented themselves, and if not, why not. We intend to examine their evidence rigorously, and there are, as I say, 8 basic questions which we will need to explore with those who took decisions, the incident commanders in particular. 1, what was the LFB policy, if any, for assessing the materials and construction of a high-rise residential block? 2, was that policy applied at Grenfell Tower? 3, what, if any, was the policy in case compartmentation in a high-rise block failed? 4, when exactly did it become obvious to the incident commanders on the ground at Grenfell Tower that that compartmentation had failed? 5, what, if any, change to their strategy did they put in place thereafter, and how? 6, why was the formal stay-put policy maintained until 2:47 a.m. and not revoked earlier? 7, what difference that revocation made given the volumes of evacuation before that time? And 8, how did the change in formal strategy get communicated to residents? Now this, of course, is not an exhaustive list of questions. There are many more. In terms of the evidence from the firefighters relevant to Phase 1, those can be distilled into some 18 separate subtopics. The response to the initial fire in the kitchen of Flat 16. Incident, command and control. Communications, including A, communications within the building, and B, communications between incident command and those responsible for directing and carrying out of the firefighting response. Control room, its functions and responsibilities, and in particular, communication of fire survival guidance, or FSG, from the control room to occupants of Grenfell Tower. FSG and the stay-put policy, including firefighters' understanding of that policy, its application and its withdrawal. The quality of the mobile data terminal information, or MDT information. Predetermined attendance, or PDA, information and policy. access to the fire ground and access to and from the tower, including the effect of falling debris. The establishment and operation of the bridgehead during the course of the firefighting response. Fire spread. Smoke spread. Firefighting itself, including the use of ladders, aerial platforms, etc. The use and operation of breathing apparatus. Search and rescue experiences. Dry risers, including their use and functionality. Any water pressure related issues, including any previous difficulties encountered fighting fires in high-rise buildings, for example, Trellick Tower in April 2017. Training. The behaviour of the building during the course of evacuation. All of those topics, either separately and together, will be examined in detail during phase 1. I now turn to fire survival guidance and stay put advice. In terms of fire survival guidance that was given to residents of Grenfell Tower on the night of the fire, I want to say just a little bit more at this stage. It will be necessary to establish precisely what guidance residents were given, both before and during the fire, and how that was understood and how it was acted upon. We have evidence of fire action notices being provided in the tower, as is illustrated from this photograph taken from Dr. Lane's report. And the essence of the fire survival guidance, or the stay put policy, is contained in the middle of that notice. We will turn to the language of the notice in due course. This particular notice was found in the lift lobbies by the lifts. We want to understand how residents interpreted this sign and other guidance that they were given, and for those who left the tower in the early stages of the fire, why they did so, notwithstanding this advice. I have mentioned earlier that the evidence currently suggests that around 187 occupants, about 64%, had evacuated the tower by the time the stay put policy was formally abandoned at 2:47 a.m. The evidence also suggests that the rate of evacuation substantially slowed from 1:38 a.m. Before that time, 144 people had left the building, and after the stay put guidance was changed an hour later at 2:47 or so, only 36 people managed to escape the tower. It may be that the withdrawal of the formal stay put guidance at that stage was just that, a mere formality, in light of the number of occupants who had managed to escape safely before that time. On the other hand, it may be that the formal maintenance of that advice until 2:47 a.m. made all the difference between life and death. For those who received fire survival guidance, we will want to understand precisely what guidance was being given to them by LFB control or by others, and what factors were influencing their decision whether to stay in their flats or to attempt to escape. To that end, a significant number of 999 call transcripts have been disclosed to call participants, and many may well be relevant to that question. One pressing question is whether it was appropriate to maintain the formal stay put strategy, whatever that was, until 2:47 a.m., or whether it could and should have been withdrawn sooner. In that regard, evidence regarding the conditions in the lobbies and the stairs will be crucially important, not least so as to understand at what times it would have been possible and safe for individuals to escape if they had been advised to do so. Now, the submissions of the G3 group of bereaved survivors and residents assert at paragraph 68 that it is beyond argument, quotes unquotes, that many more would have survived than did survive if the stay-put policy had been abandoned at 1:26 a.m. or at any rate long before 2:47 a.m. With respect, that is not a proper submission. First, it is an assertion made without any evidence and before any evidence is called. Secondly, it is very far from beyond argument. This is an inquiry to lay bare the truth. It is not litigation. And the question as to what effect the withdrawal of the formal stay-put policy and its timing actually had in fact must be explored in the evidence before any conclusions can be reached about it. As I have already mentioned, we will be hearing from all of the incident commanders who were responsible for the decision-making on the night, and we will seek to understand the factors which they took into account when making the decisions they did and the conditions the fire service was facing as the situation unfolded in front of them. That will involve studying the LFB policies in place, the national policies in place, and whether the incident commanders were trained in those policies and whether that training informed their decision-making on the night. The inquiry will also consider the liaison between the firefighters and the other emergency services and the volunteers on the ground, as well as the important question of the efficacy of the communications between the LFB and the other emergency services, as well as the communications themselves between individual firefighters on the ground on the night. Mr. Chairman, finally, before I conclude this opening statement, I should like to provide, if I may, an update on the progress of preparation for Phase 2. In order to provide a framework in which Phase 2 can be managed, the inquiry has updated its provisional list of issues. A copy of this updated list can be found on the inquiry's website. 2 points should be noted by core participants. First, this is not and is not intended to be a final list of the issues that will be addressed by the inquiry. Inevitably, the list will be reviewed and revised as the inquiry's investigation proceeds. Secondly, and specifically, the inquiry team has been considering the final report published by Dame Judith Hackett on the 17th of May 2017 and her conclusions. We will update the list of issues to reflect any further issues that need to be investigated which flow out of the Hackett report, and in particular we will examine her recommendations. Some 25 or so letters are about to be or have just been sent to the corporate and governmental core participants under Rule 9 of the Inquiry Rules 2006. Those letters request written witness statements from persons from whom we propose to take evidence from those core participants, and those statements have been asked to be served by 4 p.m. on the 28th of September 2018. The inquiry has asked that the statements address very specific identified issues by reference to the updated list of issues, as well as any other matters in relation to which a witness may be able to assist the investigation. Where possible, the inquiry has asked for witness statements from identified individuals who, in the inquiry's view, will be able to give detailed evidence in relation to relevant matters. Given the apparent need to extract a full and clear case out of many of these core participants, rather than our relying on them to make admissions against their interests, we expect these requests to be taken seriously, and we will pursue proper, detailed responses with vigour. We hope that core participants will resist the temptation to indulge in a merry-go-round of buck passing, but will identify exactly their role in the chain of events, leading to Grenfell Tower becoming what our experts preliminarily consider to be a major hazard. It is hoped that those core participants who receive these invitations will not need to be reminded of the Chairman's powers of compulsion under Section 21 of the Inquiries Act. The inquiry will provide Phase 2 disclosure on a rolling basis between October 2018 and the end of January 2019. It is anticipated that disclosure will be provided on an issue-related basis. Although these precise dates will be confirmed in due course, the Chairman, I should say, is minded to propose that in addition to any supplemental statements that may be sought by the inquiry or provided by particular witnesses, all core participants will provide by 30th of March 2019 a statement of response to the issues. This document, which is to be verified by a statement of truth, will contain an individual core participant's response to the issues that directly concern them, as well as any other matters in relation to which they consider that they will be able to assist the inquiry. The aim of the statement of response is essentially threefold. First, to enable the core participants to set out their precise positions in relation to the issues. Secondly, to provide an aid to the efficient case management of Phase 2. And thirdly, to identify common ground as well as the truly contentious issues. As matters stand, the inquiry anticipates that Phase 2 hearings will not start before April or May 2019, but as its investigation proceeds, the inquiry will confirm a timetable and a start date for Phase 2, as well as further information regarding the structure of Phase 2. Everything that I have said about the programme for Phase 2 will, of course, have to be subject to any decisions about it that any other panel members may make once they are appointed. Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, that, reduced to its basic core elements, is an introduction to and an overview of Phase 1 of this inquiry. I now propose to hand over to the first of the core participants to address you, but that will be tomorrow. I'm glad to say we finished a little bit earlier than I was expecting to today. I hope that causes no inconvenience to anybody. I intend to reserve to myself a short slot at the end of all the core participants' oral addresses in order to respond to any points that have arisen which may assist you or them further. So, Mr. Chairman, subject to that, that is all I propose to say by way of opening Phase 1 to the inquiry. In the timetable, you will have noticed that I have been asked to read Harley Fassad's opening statement into the record. I don't intend to lend my voice to the text, but I will take it as read, and it will be available from now on the inquiry's website. Mr. Chairman, unless I can assist you further, anybody else, that is our opening statement.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, I think we're going to hear next from Mr. Johnson on behalf of the Metropolitan Police. Mr. Johnson, you weren't expecting to be on your feet this afternoon, I think, is that right?
That's correct.
And you might find it more convenient to start tomorrow morning?
That would be very convenient.
Yes, all right. Well, we've gone rather shorter than we expected. I don't suppose anyone will mind that too much. So I will rise now and we'll resume tomorrow here at 10 o'clock. Thank you very much.